The three pillars of a successful policy, I think, have to be, number one, better education, especially in the K through 12 years. Number two, better employment and kind of the kinds of workforce programs that lead to better employment outcomes. And then number three, less crime and less incarceration.
With respect to the issues of racial inequality, which are many, what would be some of the policy proposals or endeavors, policy initiatives that you think would be most important to talk about?
Well, before I get there, I want to say that I think within this realm of racial inequality, the plight of Black boys and Black men needs to be front and center. And of course, Glenn, when you and I interacted that over 40 years ago, and Richard Freeman and I were editing a volume on Black youth, in some sense, that was the beginning of a conversation. But so many things have evolved. And that's been, to me, that's been an underdeveloped area, both of conversation and policy. For instance, when you look at Black girls and Black women, on some dimensions, they're doing quite well and their outcomes have improved. Certainly on employment, the numbers started getting much better in the 80s and 90s. If you look at upward mobility measures among, say, women or girls born into lower income families, Black girls in those families experience as much personal earnings and employment mobility and education mobility as do white and Latino women. They're really doing reasonably well. It's when you turn to the men, the boys and the men, that the numbers look much worse, which then, of course, brings down household incomes in the Black community because then the marriage rates are so much lower. So I want to go back to a focus on Black boys and Black men. And of course, we can get to a more of a political discussion later. I find it interesting that it's really the men who seem to be abandoning traditional progressive politics, the Democrats in some ways. So we can come back to that. But to me, that's a second reason that we got to focus more clearly on the boys and the men. And when we focus on them, the three pillars of a successful policy, I think, have to be, number one, better education, especially in the K through 12 years. Number two, better employment and kind of the kinds of workforce programs that lead to better employment outcomes. And then number three, less crime and less incarceration. And I'd be happy to follow up in each of those three areas, talk about what I think the evidence shows about what would work, what kinds of things we want to try to scale up.
I think that's a good plan. Education, employment, and incarceration as the venues where you look for policy initiative focused on Black men. I want to ask some questions first. I mean, the big question I have is, are the women going to let the politics focus on men? I mean, isn't there a gender tension down underneath the surface of this that about, the issue of abortion, for example, is so important in the political realm and in the Democrats' framework. And the Me Too is a recent memory. Can we focus on men just as a political reality? Are the women going to let you?
Well, so it's illegal to have policies only for men, right? So we can't do that. We can't say, this is a training program and it's only going to be for men. We can do things in areas, and this was a lesson, one of many lessons I learned from the great William Julius Wilson, that you focus on policies in areas that you think will disproportionately serve the people who are most left behind. And I think we can do that if we focus on the right policies in these three areas. The political dimension is very interesting, I think. And about in the early 2000s, when I was writing a lot of this stuff with my late colleague, Paul Offner, and we talked about the need to have reforms in areas like child support to make it easier for Black non-custodial fathers to try to keep up with their required payments. And there were attacks on us for doing that from organizations like NOW, the National Organization of Women. It seemed to us in some ways that a lot of those attacks were coming from upper middle class, often white women who came from a certain ideological position and resented any kind of effort to help men. I felt less of that from African American women and the women who were active in these communities who understood the great difficulties faced by black boys and black men, and that if you can help them, you might improve marriage rates and you might improve child support rates. And ultimately, that would provide benefits to black moms and their kids, the kids for whom they have custody. So I don't think there was a uniform opposition to that. But again, with the right caveats. We're not talking about discriminatory policy, but policies to help those who have been most left behind.
Now, you say black men. Is the gender disparity in outcomes, the outcomes that we'd be concerned about, bigger amongst blacks than it is amongst whites? Or are we observing a general phenomenon in the society along gender lines that just happens to have its most, deleterious expression in the low-income communities that might be disproportionately black?
You are certainly correct that, for instance, in education, on almost every dimension of education, girls and women outperform boys and men. That's true for every racial group in the US and indeed in most societies in the world. So there is something generic about gender differences in education that we haven't fully figured out. And I think the gap between black boys and black girls is not dramatically larger than that gender gap is in other communities. It's probably a little larger because the dropout rate among black boys remains fairly high, and you have problems of disciplinary actions for behavioral issues that then exacerbate those gaps. But when you look at employment, that's where the unique situation of black men really becomes apparent. First of all, Latino men, especially the immigrants, work in very large numbers. Now, there's wage gaps, but their employment rates, their labor force activity is quite high compared to native-born whites and blacks. When you look at black men, not only are their employment outcomes worse relative to the other groups of men, if you calculate them the right way, in other words, there's a lot of black men missing from those numbers because they're incarcerated or they don't show up in the household surveys. When you adjust for the missing black men, their employment rates sometimes look worse than those of black women. There's no other group for whom that's true. And similarly for incarceration. So on education, you might find similar gender gaps, but on employment and crime and incarceration, the gaps are uniquely large between black women and black men.
So I have a speculation that's uninformed, and I wonder if it makes any sense at all. And that is that the family responsibilities of the reproduction across generations of, kids fall on women disproportionately and are quickening in a person's life. You have a kid, you're responsible for the kid. You kind of don't do drugs as frequently. You don't not work as much because, you're responsible for the kid. And if there's anything that's different between racial groups in America, it is family structure and sort of social relations of reproduction. I could call it like that. And what that militates in favor of is less responsibility because of high out of wedlock birth rates and low marriage rates and high single parenthood and a large proportion of children being raised by a mother alone. Relatively less pressure to, behave responsibly on men than women, which is disproportionate in the black community for the reasons that I've cited, and which reflects itself in the kind of statistics on education and employment that you're calling attention to. Does that make any sense?
I think it does. I might use slightly different descriptors for that situation. By the way, there's a wonderful book by an economist named Melissa Kearney at the University of Maryland on this very topic. And of course, she and other people emphasize that you look at the working class of any racial group, the incidence of single parenthood is really rising quite dramatically. But it remains highest in the black community, as you point out. And there have been other scholars looking at how exactly that comes to pass. I think Ron Mincy has done great work on this. Catherine Eden has done great works on this as well. And when I think about what's going on there, to me, I think you're right. There is a failure to accept responsibility, but it's part of a more complex set of circumstances, I think, that have evolved over time, in which a lot of these young men, again, if they've dropped out of school, maybe they've dropped out of the workforce, I think the opportunities they face, partly because of society, partly maybe their own choices, really limits their ability to be good providers. So it's this complex set. The people who say it's all structural barriers and bias, it's some of that. The people who say it's lack of personal responsibility, there's some of that. I think those things interact and reinforce each other. And especially Catherine Eden's work on this kind of talks about how when the mom becomes pregnant, first bears the child, there is a sincere desire on the part of Black men to be a good parent, not necessarily married, but to pay child support and try to do the right thing, and how over time that just doesn't persist in many cases, that those good intentions, when they come up at the reality of unstable work experience in the labor market, maybe substance problems, maybe a criminal record of some kind, that their good intentions don't last over time, and the tension rises between the parents, and the Black men fall away, and then might do that whole same cycle with a second or third mom. This phenomenon of what people call complex families, where the dad might be a non-custodial dad in multiple families and have gone through similar cycles. So I think some of what you said is true, but I think the context is difficult and challenging, and it's within that context that we have to. And it's very hard to change this behavior through policy. I think Ron Mincy has taught us that we can do some things on child support to help the dads be more supportive. But Isabel Sawhill, an outstanding scholar at Brookings, has written about this, and she says, contraception is where you can have some real policy effects, but changing marriage rates, we just don't have good evidence on how to do that.
Now, the subtext that I hear in your most recent remarks is, I hope that the subtext is, don't blame the victim. Don't be judgmental. Understand that, yeah, people have responsibilities, but there's also forces that are acting on them, and it's a multidimensional problem. And when you put the racial on it, it's like Blacks are higher, Blacks are less, whatever. And then it's like you're saying something about Black culture, and that's an overly simplistic way of thinking about it. Am I onto something there?
I'm trying, first of all, to distance myself from simplistic, one-sided points of view, as I said, both on the left and the right, both which don't help me that much. Each of them has a piece of truth. I do think the reality is more complicated. I would never use an expression like blame the victim, because I think even victimhood, and Glenn, I remember years ago when you used an expression called comparative victimology, when groups are arguing with each other about who's, I think getting into a whole conversation about victims, I don't say that. I want people to take more responsibility, and I do think, and I've written my friend Michael Strain at the American Enterprise Institute, and we were together on a panel of the National Academy of Sciences, which came up with a lot of good policy prescriptions to improve opportunity. But at the same time, we also embraced Melissa Kearney's book, and we say this has to be about opportunity and responsibility. And in fact, when people behave responsibly, they end up getting more opportunity, right? And on all of these different dimensions, they have to not drop out of school. They have to not drop out of the labor force. They should use good contraception. And if they bear a child, they need to take responsibility. So I don't want to use this, I'm not going to blame the victim frame. But I just want a framing that acknowledges both responsibility and other challenges. And it's not either or. That's the problem with the left and the right. They both want to make it one or the other instead of a complex world where both matter. But responsibility is very important.